welcome to Slam, the podcast that reviews every single DC superhero ever created. I'm your co-host, Mike Al, and I'm joined by very special guest, Paul. Thanks for joining me, Paul.
Anytime.
Awesome. All right, and you are a DC aficionado, but I believe you didn't become one until later. Am I correct? You started out with Marvel?
No, you're incorrect.
Backwards. Am I backwards?
I first, I think I taught myself to read, I believe, on DC Comics.
Okay.
When I was about 4 years old, I loved everything I could get, which was Batman, any Superman, Superboy related title, Green Lantern and Flash. And I seem to remember Justice League because I remember Martian Manhunter from that time. So it was DC Comics. Those were what I saw first, and I loved them. And I remember even at that young age, 4 years old, 5 years old, I just loved the name Flash. You know, as soon as I looked up on the rack and I saw Flash, it just, that name really got me. And I loved the outfit, the red and the yellow and the jagged bit and the lightning bolt. That, and I also loved the name Green Lantern.
Oh, yes.
You know, you could say why, but I don't know. I was just like 5 years old and those names really struck me. And when I was about 6, I think Donovan, pop star Donovan, friend of the Beatles, had a song, what was it called? Sunshine Superman?
That's right.
Superman and Green Lantern ain't got nothing on me. And I remember being excited as a little kid. Wow, he's singing about Superman and Green Lantern. And now when I look back on those comics, which I wish I still had, of course, yeah, I've got the typical mother story, I'm afraid. When we moved, I was 8, everything got left behind, just left behind. And when I look at them now, I mean, I see that was kind of early, kind of Gil Kane superhero stuff and Carmine Infantino stuff, but I didn't know who they were, and
Sure.
I didn't think about the art at all then. I just know that I loved the names Flash, Green Lantern. I loved the Flash's outfit. I loved just even seeing the titles, Superman, Superboy, Jimmy Olsen. Even if there was a Jimmy Olsen, I was excited, and Batman, and so I loved it all. But then when I was about 7, I came across my first Marvel, which was a black and white reprint weekly, and it had X-Men, Thor, and something else, and that was it. Absolutely, that as soon as I read X-Men 1 and the Jack Kirby Thor, and I never gave DC another thought. And then it wasn't until many years later, because I couldn't see any American comics for about a 5-year period, where I moved to. And then it was just all Marvel, because Marvel was what the American comics I rediscovered when I was 13. And I hardly saw any DC. But then occasionally I saw some DC. And whenever I picked one up, I didn't like it. I just, in comparison to Marvel in the 70s, I just didn't like it. But there were occasional things. Steve Englehart detectives and things like that. Yeah, but no, for me, when I was a little kid, that was the magic for me. Flash, Green Lantern, everything. So, you know, we're reviewing Flash 1, 2, 3, which was a few years before I started reading, but still in that vein.
Sure. Interesting, because I'll just tell you my quick story. I first got into comics through the Richard Donner Superman films, the Adam West Batman, which I thought was new in the late 80s, in the late 70s when I was watching it, as well as the Spider-Man live action show and the Spider-Man cartoon. So the first 3 comics I bought would have been DC Comics Presents with Superman, A Brave and the Bold Batman, and A Spectacular Spider-Man, right? And I just had a few. And then a couple years went by, and it wasn't until G.I. Joe and Transformers came out, I started buying their comics. But I didn't buy any superheroes for 2 or 3 years. And then I got into X-Men, Daredevil, Avengers, New Mutants, whatever Marvel was putting out. And just like you, I didn't like, honestly, I didn't even look at DC at the time. So this would have been 86, 87, 88, almost no DC. Maybe a movie tie-in. If they did one, I would maybe buy that. But other than that, no superheroes. It wasn't until I picked up a Jim Starlin Batman drawn by Jim Aparo that I really liked. Then I bought a couple more. Then Death in the Family happened, and I really liked that. And that's what got me hooked on Batman. And then within a year after that, they did the movie, right? And so by that point, it was equal. And then by the 90s, I was completely off Marvel, completely. And then after the 2000s, then it was kind of evil. Equal after that.
Kind of
Yeah, evil. It was evil, but yes, equal after that. Yeah. So.
Well, everybody has their own story. I should make clear, though, that even though it was like Marvel for me through just about from 73 to the end of the 70s, the longer Jim Shooter's editorship went on, and after Dick Giordano returned to DC, things gradually began to change. And then one day, while I was at university in Scotland, and I went into Edinburgh to buy, latest comics, on the train ride back to Stirling from Edinburgh, I suddenly realized, wow, I think I have just as many, if not more, DC than Marvel.
Right.
And the longer that the 80s went on, the more DC I bought, the fewer Marvels I bought.
Right.
In the 90s, my buying was very, very sporadic. I think because I went back to Europe for a couple of years. A lot of people dismissed the 90s in many ways, but there was some very good stuff in the 90s, actually. But for me, my DC heydays were when I was 4 years old to 6 years old, for sure. And then from about all through the 80s. The 80s, they just got better and better and better. And if you ask me to talk about comics for the 80s, yeah, I mean, there are some occasional Marvel highlights. I would say, the obvious ones, the Claremont Byrne X-Men, but that wasn't too far into the 80s. If at all, I'd have to go back and check. The Miller Daredevils, the John Byrne Fantastic Four, Nam, Doug Murray and Michael Golden, and the Michelini Layton Iron Man, and and the Walt Simonson Thors. And apart from that, no. But DC, yes, I mean, I think I was getting more and more DC stuff every time I turned around.
Sure.
Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, Grant Morrison's Animal Man, Teen Titans, Marv Wolfman, George Perez, Crisis. Well, I should be able to name more and more, but there was the Gene Colan Batmans, the DC Comics Presents had a lot of good stuff. So yeah, I became more and more DC in the 80s, less and less Marvel.
Absolutely, I'm with you there. But we're here today to talk about a monumental DC two storylines. But the first one we're going to talk about is the introduction of Earth 2 in the multiverse itself, which happened in Flash 123. If you'd like, would you like to summarize this one and I'll summarize the next one?
Yeah, because there always seems to be more to the story. I'm sorry when I say things, because you ask me simple questions and I should give a simple response, and it's always complex. So I apologize.
No, it's interesting. It's always interesting to hear your perspective on everything. Absolutely. So.
Right. So I'm one of the people who really appreciated Crisis in the mid-80s.
Sure.
I know many, many DC fans, oh no, that was the end of DC, and oh my God, and how could they do away with the Earth ABC, XYZ, and all this kind of stuff. But for me, I was overjoyed. I thought, yeah, this is exactly what I need from DC Comics. Exactly. Just give me one damn Earth. Don't give me multiple Earths. Don't give me 2, 3. Just give me one Earth where it all takes place, where it's all unified. So I really was glad for Crisis, and I really appreciated it, and it was all on one Earth. And then I bought them even more eagerly, including Wonder Woman by George Perez, every month. What? I'm buying Wonder Woman. This is revolutionary. What's happening? However, I thought that back in 1961, even though I wasn't reading at that time, this was a very good move by DC to say, look, we used to have Flash in the 1940s. The current Flash, Barry Allen Flash, is so different from the Jay Garrick Flash. Do we just ignore what happened in the 1940s with all these previous guys, the previous Flash, the previous Green Lantern, and all this? Or do we say, let's say all the stuff that we had before, that's on an alternate Earth, like Earth 2.
Right.
And I think that's a good idea. Now we can make a clear break between what we had before and what we have now in the Silver Age. So let's just have like an Earth 1 and an Earth 2. So the irony is, I loved Crisis. I really appreciated Crisis because it simplified everything, unified everything. But I also I applaud DC for creating Earth 1, Earth 2.
Yes, I agree.
Just out the Golden Age from the Silver Age. So from that perspective, that was good. That was good. And that issue, Flash 1, 2, 3, Flash of Two Worlds, was I don't want to use hyperbole, or as Monty Python would say, hyperbole. But it was a wonderful issue. It's beautifully simplistic, even though they're presenting two Earths. It's very charming. It's very sentimental. It's very heartwarming. The storytelling is very clear,
yes,
and precise, and nobody's going to get lost. At the same time, it didn't seem to write down to you, because after all, these are mainly children reading it, and there's a creation of an Earth 1 and Earth 2 and two Flashes. And I thought they did it in a very charming way, including the Barry Allen Flash saying, well, I used to read about your adventures in Flash comics.
Right.
My world, and apparently the stories about you from your world came to the writer, was it Gardner Fox?
Gardner Fox, yep.
Came to him in his sleep. And I just thought it was very charming. So here you have Barry Allen performing at a charity fundraiser, and has apparently vibrated a bit too fast and found himself in a completely other world, which is Earth 2. This is the world of the Golden Age DC comics characters and villains, featuring the Jay Garrick Flash, and up against, coming out of retirement to go up against some old foes. And he finds he can't do it by himself. Barry Allen's Flash is also trying to do it by himself. And then they realize they have to team up. So they team up to overcome the foes. And I'm trying to remember their names. There's the fiddler, plays the violin.
There's also the thinker.
The thinker, the fiddler, and Shade.
And Shade, yep.
Yeah, who manipulates darkness. And, you know, the older villainous characters, you notice none of them were ever like muscle bound.
Yeah, I'm looking at that right now. Right.
You know, like Bane. Bane for me is boring as crap. Just so I can't stand these muscle bound, boring characters. They have no character. But the older ones, they do. And even though the thinker was just some guy with a contraption on his head, he has a certain charm about what he does and how he does it. The same with the fiddler. I mean, my God, he's playing a violin. How charming is that? And Shade looks like a Dickensian character from something like 1800s English literature.
Right.
You know? Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say there's no tights. None of them have tights. They're all in suit and tie, right?
Well, I mean, like the Shade is dressed like a character from a Dickens novel and has a weird kind of shape to him. But yeah, Think has the suit and tie.
Right.
I think, yeah, Fiddler has the suit and tie. And even though we're talking about Flash, I mean, in that vein, there's the Penguin, you know, from Batman.
Sure.
And even the Joker. And what I think is that in the in the Golden Age and early Silver Age, the villains are very theatrical. The editors and writers didn't think to make them horrifyingly muscle bound and they're going to
Agreed.
smash everything and it's all about violence.
Hmm.
It's not. They're characters. Like the penguin zooms away by having a spinning umbrella.
Hmm.
It's just great, so I enjoyed it. I know it was written primarily for kids, but you have to admire the storytelling, the way it was told, the clarity. It's well written, it's well edited, it's well paced. The characters are distinctive, the characters are charming. It's a heartwarming story in many, many ways. It's a perfect introduction to the concept of more than one Earth, of multiple Earths. It's a perfect introduction.
I agree, and I also want to point out, I'm one who, for example, I never liked Lex Luthor getting his battle suit.
Right.
I like Lex Luthor as a scientist, the world's smartest man, suit and tie. I also agree about Bane. I do like the movie version of Bane, but the comic book version never did anything for me. But there's a segment of the readership, and it could be an influence of video games, where they see villains as who would win in a fight between X and Y, and that's all they see. But they don't see the creativity of a master plan, or like you mentioned the theatrical idea of the penguin with his umbrellas, or like the motif of Two-Face having a headquarters where it's half and half, or the suit that's half and half, or the Joker with a card with his face on it.
Yeah.
That's what makes it superheroes and supervillains, right? If you're even like Ra's al Ghul, he's okay, but he's a little bit too James Bond, That's not a Batman villain. That's a James Bond villain to me. That's
Yes.
So I always prefer the Silver Age stuff in before, always, for that reason.
Yeah, I love the theater of it all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really, Batman is a theatrical character. I know it's gothic, and the origins are very, very good. Nightmarish, thunder, rain, dark, and all this kind of stuff. But to me, it's still kind of theatrical, and a complaint that people who are diehard DC, and I don't think anybody should be diehard anything.
Mm-hmm.
I think you should just go, like, with whatever's good. I mean, there's no point in just sticking to one group. Why? I mean, whatever's good is good. But
Agreed.
the diehard DC fans often, to me, seem to be against Marvel because they say that the Marvel stuff lacks intelligence. It's all about fighting. You got to fight. You got to be powerful. You got to, like, thump people around. And whereas the DC stuff relies more on intelligence and creativity and imagination. And I think there's some truth to that, because whenever Marvel Comics in its history was at a bit of a loss for ideas, and in this case, I'm going to say when Stan Lee was writing Captain America with Gene Colan, I mean, it was bereft of ideas. You'd have things like Man Brute or something, or maybe there was a dead, but some big guys punching his way. And it's boring. It's just absolutely boring. And what's so much more interesting, like Steve Englehart did with his detective run when he brought back Hugo Strange.
Sure.
And it's not about Hugo Strange being muscle bound. It's about him outsmarting Batman.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to take his place. And it's just all theatrical, and I love that. So I sound like I'm really saying how much I love DC.
Well, I mean, but this is it's funny because to the general public now, the whole idea of the multiverse, I mean, geez, right now it's been driven into the ground. But we saw it in Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. We saw it in Doctor Strange. Now we've seen it in The Flash, and it's been driven into the ground, and everything, everywhere, all at once. But I don't even know if there's the idea of the multiverse in any fiction before this issue of The Flash. I mean, I'm sure the concept existed in science, but the idea of a duplicate world with a slightly different version of a character, I don't know if it originated here. I don't want to sound ignorant. Maybe it originated somewhere else, but this was a pretty groundbreaking issue when this came out.
Yeah, I'm
And
trying to think. I'm trying
yeah,
to think more media,
I don't
books,
know.
movies. I,
This is
um,
pretty early on, 1960, right? Now the thing is even with this idea, DC, they did Earth 1, 2, 3, X, 5, whatever. And then all the way up into Crisis when they tried to get rid of it, although it all kind of came back anyway. But I'm not sure if we've talked about this, but have you read Alan Moore's Supreme?
some issues.
Okay,
I wish at some point I'm going to dedicate myself to finally getting stuff that I've often wanted to have but don't have.
sure.
I
Well,
mean, I've got some, I've got some Alan Moore stuff,
sure.
of course I have, but just a few issues of Supreme.
So yeah, the concept of the first storyline was he kind of disappears and appears, like he disappears from reality and appears in this I can't remember exactly what it's called, the supremacy, I think. And he's meeting all these other versions of himself. And he's like, well, what's going on? And they're like, oh, well, once you get rebooted from the continuity, this is where you come. And so it's kind of a commentary, a meta commentary on the idea of like rebooting a character, what happens to the old version, which Grant Morrison touched on with Animal Man, but Alan Moore really ran with it, right? Where now he's got the 1996 Supreme interacting with the 1970 Supreme and the 1960 Supreme, and all these, and they're all analogies for Superman, obviously,
Yeah,
right? But the
yeah,
thing is now that idea has been scooped by the Spider-Verse, right? And so to the general
right.
public, oh, well, this is a Marvel idea. Marvel always beats DC to the punch, just like DC had the Flash, but the general public, even though there was a Flash TV show, Quicksilver got the movie treatment first, so people associate super speed with Quicksilver now, right? But as far as the multiverse, this is where the idea really was popularized. And getting back to what you said about Crisis, I actually loved Crisis when I went, because I read it maybe in 88, 89, when I went back and read it. I loved it. But I actually do believe they should have just kept the Earth separate because no matter how they try, DC cannot figure out how to make the JSA and the JLA fit in one world. They can't
Right.
because Superman's the first superhero and everything comes after him. But instead, we're going to rewrite it so everything builds to him. But now Wonder Woman's popular, so we're going to make her the first superhero. And they just every time they get a chance to rewrite it, just because it just doesn't quite fit together. So I
Mhm.
think they had the right idea with the New 52 when they tried to go back to the like, let's just start with Superman and Batman and Flash and go from there. But unfortunately, some of the older fans preferred it the post-crisis way, so they kind of brought that back. But I honestly don't even know where they're at right now because I think they've rebooted again. We're not going to get into that.
Yeah.
But I'll just say that I agree with everything you said about the story. And I've read this before, but I actually forgot about the involvement of the supervillains. But one thing I got to say is that the Flash TV show, which I really enjoyed, I thought they really dropped the ball on the introduction of Earth 2. Now it's been a long time since I've seen it, but did you ever watch the recent Flash TV show?
I did. I watched it avidly up until a certain point, and
Right.
that certain point came when for me, there was just too much repetition
Sure.
of certain elements, and I thought, okay. But I also watched the original Flash TV show with
Sure.
Wesley
So did
Snipes.
I.
Yeah,
So, but you remember when they introduced Earth 2 in the Flash TV show, and I
yeah,
don't remember exactly how they did it, but let's put it this way, they did it all wrong because this is how you do it. You do it like the Twilight Zone, where you have the protagonist going about his normal life. He does something that goes wrong, and then all of a sudden he finds himself in a, fish out of water. Like he thinks he's in Central City, but wait, this isn't Central City. Keystone Keystone City, what's that? And then he's just finding out little clues along the way. And he realizes, oh, wait a minute, this is where the Flash from the comic books I read as a kid, this is where he lives. And so then he's like, well, then I'm going to go find Jay Garrick, right? And so it's just kind of unraveling like a little mystery. And then they introduce the whole subplot of the supervillains, and then they have to team up and all that stuff. And like you said about the storytelling, it's so clear. Carmine Infantino is not necessarily my favorite artist, but in the style of the 1960s, I'm flipping through these pages, and the art is so clear, the colors are so vibrant, and I honestly would rather read I would rather read a Gil Kane Green Lantern than a Neil Adams Green Lantern. Even though I love Neil Adams, I still like the Silver Age stuff better. Gardner Fox over Denny O'Neil any day. I'd
yeah.
rather read this stuff. So
I, I, I've Yeah, I wish I could say differently. I've never liked Denny O'Neil's comic book writing, and when I was at a convention, San Diego convention, I think like in '83 or so, there was something he said on a panel which really made me, for sure, have no appreciation of Denny O'Neil. Where another comics pro on the panel turned to him and said, "Well, don't you have any like ambition, like in for what you're doing in comics or whatever, or what you would like to do?" And he said, "No, it's just basically it's just a job."
That's
I
horrible.
thought,
Yeah.
wow, wow, this is how you feel about it. You don't have any passion for it. You don't have any vision for it. It's just like you just churn them out like sausage, like a sausage factory, and it's just uninspired. But to not get off track, yeah,
Yeah.
I know Neil Adams. I've got the Neil Adams all but one Neil Adams run on Green Lantern, but those stories they're really heavy-handed, and even the Denny O'Neil Batmans, they're
I
heavy-handed.
agree. I agree.
So, but the Silver Age Green Lantern, of course, I loved when I was a kid, but Gil Kane didn't like it, even though he drew it.
Really interesting.
He said he thought it was basically too kind of infantile for his artwork. He had to draw what was written, but and I'm sorry, I have to say, I kind of agree sometimes. When you see the power of the ring it could be unlimited. It depends on the
Sure.
imagination. And you're coming up with like a hammer or a vacuum cleaner. It's like,
Sure.
come on.
Sure.
This is
Sure.
power ring. Just use your imagination. I mean, if it's going to be a vacuum cleaner, at least is it like top rated or something?
Sure. 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 I know. Well, I have to agree that I don't. I think of the Silver Age DC comics. Superman's my favorite, but none of them are as good as they were when I was younger, when I was a
Of
kid.
course, of
But
course.
I try to read it from the point of view, like when I go back and read these comics now, I try to see it from the point of view of a kid. Even
Mm.
reading this issue, I mean, obviously I appreciate it, but if I was 8 years old reading this, my mind would have been blown. The idea of another Flash on another world, and
Yes.
if they were to adapt this story, I mean, obviously they would update the dialogue, but I really think the structure of the story works the way it does, and the way that the characters are introduced works. And like you said, the supervillains in this are just great. So yeah, I have nothing but good things to say about the story. So I think we can both agree that we recommend this story then, right? For other people?
Yeah, and I think that the context is we must remember that it was written primarily for kids.
Right.
Nevertheless, the professionalism in the storytelling from both
Yep.
writing and art is excellent.
Agreed, agreed. So now we're going to jump to, there's actually one Earth 2 story in between that I kind of forgot about. It's another issue of The Flash. I'm not sure, it might have been 137 or something, where he teams up with Jay Garrick again, and they actually end up rescuing the JSA from stasis. I can't remember exactly how it worked out, but at the end of that story, they're kind of back in action, and then they kind of just move on to the next thing. But in this issue of Justice League of America, we finally bring back the Justice Society in full force. And I don't even know if I've ever read this full issue, but I've seen this cover 1,000 times. Everyone knows this cover. The JSA sitting around in a circle around a crystal ball, holding hands, and this cloud of smoke is coming up, and the JSA are all looking down at them. I think this cover is incredible. The clarity of the art, the smile on everybody's faces. Again, just gorgeous Silver Age colors. What do you think of this cover, Paul?
Nothing in
Nothing in particular.
no, the way you describe it, of course, is how it is, and I think that's thematically it's great.
Mm.
As you said, they're sitting around, and there's this, like floating above them. So I think it was the right way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, I mean, I can't say I've got any particular feeling for it.
Well, here's the thing: is that before we even get to the story, the art in this issue and the next one by Mike Sekowsky He's not a great artist by any stretch.
Right.
However, right, he is drawing in the Silver Age style, so I can appreciate the style. But the cover, while it is penciled by Mike Sekowsky, it's inked by Murphy Anderson, and he's one of my favorite inkers.
Yes, yes. So
So
that's why.
yeah, so I think it gives it that extra polish.
Yeah,
Um,
to be fair to Mike Sekowsky, he had a lot of characters to draw, and it takes a
sure,
special artist to be able to take that on. I think not many artists do or
right.
do want to do that. It's easier to draw just solo character. So I guess he deserves credit for that. But I don't know. I found the art hard to digest visually.
Yeah, I didn't enjoy because it's actually the same writer. It's Gardner Fox. I did not enjoy this two-parter nearly as much as I enjoyed the Flash issue.
Right.
And it was really hard for me to figure out why. I mean, I like you mentioned, there's a lot of characters in this book, a lot. There's
Too many.
too many, yeah, and it's hard to keep track of them, and they've got to split off into teams, but sometimes the teams don't quite make sense. They're juggling a lot of characters, juggling a lot of subplots. And also I think another big issue, and this is one of the biggest criticisms of DC at this time, is that the characters all act almost exactly the same.
Yeah, of course they do, which is it's a fact. I mean, everybody says this.
Right.
I mean, whether a person's Marvel fan, DC fan, they do. They're all the same.
And the thing is, I mean, compared to 60s Marvel, which I've been reading a lot of lately, there's a lot of forced conflict, right? Where somebody will like, the Thing will say the wrong thing to Reed Richards. The next thing you know, they're punching each other. Or Hawkeye says something to Captain America and he's kicked out of the
Yeah.
team or whatever it may be. And I'm not saying I expect that, but even like, for example, Star Trek: The Next Generation, which the whole premise of the show is that there's not supposed to be any conflict in the 24th century, they still managed to have different points of view clashing, like ideologies clashing with each other, which I'd at least have like to have seen with this, right? It doesn't mean they have to be fist fighting. It just means they have to have a different perspective on things, which they don't. So it kind of made this story a struggle to get through as a story. However, I just want to talk about the idea of teaming these characters up. The one thing that I always wondered about this is technically with the JSA, they could have picked any lineup, but I always wondered why, when you have is it 7 or 8, 9 members of the Justice League here, why did they? To me, I would have done a 1-to-1. I would have had the original Oliver Queen, the original Green Lantern, the original Batman, but instead they mix and matched it with Dr. Fate, Black Canary, Hourman. Did you ever wonder about that? But why they didn't do the 1-to-1?
It just kind of gave me a headache.
Okay.
Because when my mind reaches a kind of defining point, such as there are too many characters here, this is too congested.
Right.
It's kind of like an overload, and then I shut down.
Sure.
So I wish I could say I did wonder, but my mind was in protect mode.
Okay. Fight or flight. So I take it you had not read this issue before this week, right?
Yeah, thank goodness.
Interesting. Oh, interesting. No, because I might have read it, but it didn't really. I do remember maybe 10, 15 years ago reading some of these early Justice Leagues and being disappointed, like just wondering, like, oh, I thought these would be better, but they just didn't grab me. But I do like the idea of the superheroes all teaming up. Again, something Alan Moore did with Supreme. I believe they were called the Allied Supermen of America. He did it with Tom Strong, Golden Age versions, alternate Earth versions. So the concept is brilliant. I love seeing, the more Atomic Age one-piece costumes of Green Lantern and Atom and Flash versus the Golden Age versions. I love seeing Hawkman with his yellow skull cap, right? So I do love the idea of this story. It's just that it was a struggle to read. I didn't enjoy reading it the way I did the Flash one, and it's a two-parter, but again, I love this cover inked by Murphy Anderson of the two Green Lanterns teaming up, but getting through the story was a struggle. And I guess the only thing I could say about it is I love the idea, but not the story. And the thing is I've read a lot of reviews by people like, for example, the magazine Amazing Heroes. I remember reading people who were reading Justice League at the time, and even they felt that the series was never as great as it could have been, and it wasn't even as good as these early issues. Like this was the peak, pretty much. So I think Justice League was always a book that DC struggled with, where to me it should have been great, but it never really clicked, you know. And it just this year, I had 2 boxes worth of Jerry Conway Justice Leagues, okay? That I tried. I'm like, here we go. I'm going to sit down and read the whole run. Good luck. I could not get through those issues. And I do like Jerry Conway, but those were a struggle to get through. I don't know if you've ever read those before.
Again, I'm afraid I wish I could just give you a simple answer, but I got to
No,
give you.
no. Okay, give me the complicated answer.
So I'm pretty sure that I may have seen Justice League when I was like 4, 5 years old.
Okay,
Otherwise, I don't know, how would I have known about Martian Manhunter?
sure.
Because at school, when I was about 5 years old, I used to do drawings of superhero stuff and get paid for it.
Oh, nice.
I remember drawing Martian Manhunter as well. So maybe I did.
Sure,
Jerry Conway, I enjoyed reading his Spider-Man and
sure. Me too.
Fantastic Four and Thor. I mean, really, I did. But the next time I read Justice League was when Steve Englehart was writing it. Steve Englehart was my favorite writer in the 70s. I almost felt like he could do no wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, he just had that 1 year run, I think like 104 to 143, whatever
like
it
that,
was.
yeah.
141. I keep going down to 150. And I thought, wow, yeah, you know, I quite enjoy this. I remember the 150th issue with the key, and that cover was very good. And I thought, yeah, Steve Englehart has made these guys interesting. And then came 151. I think it was Jerry Conway took over immediately. I think so.
I think so, yeah.
And no, it just going down. But who wrote Justice League 200? Was that Jerry Conway with George Perez?
Okay, I'm gonna say I think it was, because Jerry Conway did Justice League for like 12 years. So I'm pretty sure it had to be Jerry Conway.
George Perez on Crisis, I'm sure, is a huge contributor to the success of Crisis. George Perez on Teen Titans obviously was a huge contributor, because without George Perez on Teen Titans, it was never as good.
That's true.
Now,
100%.
Jerry Conway on Justice League wasn't good, but Jerry Conway with George Perez was different. And the 200th issue, the anniversary issue, is generally regarded as one of the greatest anniversary issues in the history of comics. So I'm tempted to say, like many writers, they're really good when they have particular artists.
Yes.
And I think Jerry Conway was good with the contributions of George Perez. And this happens a lot. I mean, again, just a little detour. Chris Claremont, without either Dave Cockrum or John Byrne, is nowhere near as effective. It's just so different. His storytelling is kind of unrestrained. So I think Jerry Conway, Justice League, we agree, I think, that no, Jerry Conway, Justice League, not good. But Jerry Conway, Justice League with George Perez, that's different.
You know, I gotta give 2 counterpoints. It's only taken me about 40 years to realize, but I've done book clubs with other people who read, like for example, non-regular comics readers. Sometimes they'll read a graphic novel and they will not even look at the art. They'll just read the dialogue and the captions. And if something happens in the art that's not told in the writing, they won't even see it. That's how some people are. But it's not just that George Perez is he draws pretty pictures. His art is telling the story. So it's like you just said, like I was just before we did this call, I was reading some. Do you remember the series Valor?
Yes.
Yes, which was Mon-El, basically, the post-zero hour Mon-El or pre-zero
Yeah.
hour, whatever. The early issues were okay, but then once Colleen Doran became the artist, it became much better because Colleen Doran is a really good artist, I think. And it's like Mark Waid's writing all of a sudden becomes more organized and focused because the art is more organized and focused.
Yeah.
And and George Perez, master storyteller. So of course the story is going to come through as being better. But the one thing I want to say about Chris Claremont, obviously the Byrne era and the Cockrum era are probably my favorites as far as nostalgia and as far as like the magic of that early era. But I do think the Paul Smith era is my favorite. As far as the actual writing by Chris Claremont, I think his writing got better in that time.
Well, it's possible. I'd have to have a reread. I mean, I don't know anybody that dislikes Paul Smith. I like Paul Smith, but I liked him even more when I learned that even though he was making a fortune on X-Men, because the sales really boomed when he was on it, his main ambition was to draw Doctor Strange.
True.
And so then he left X-Men. So he left monthly X-Men, where he's earning a fortune, to go and draw bi-monthly Doctor Strange, where he certainly wasn't earning a fortune. So he has my undying admiration for that. But yes, Paul Smith is a very clean storyteller as well. And I agree with your point, because if you and I are writers and we have John Byrne X-Men art, it should be almost impossible for us to screw up because the art tells the story so well. We just have to just not screw it up. Like with Jack Kirby, when Stan Lee, would Jack Kirby would concoct the stories and tell the story in art, and Stan Lee said, yeah, it's like a jigsaw puzzle for me to work out what to put regarding dialogue, thought balloons, motivation, which is a little unfair because there were notes in the margins anyway telling him this is where the characters are going, this is what the characters, this is where the story's going, this is what the characters are doing. But so again, my point is, if the art is like that, it must help a writer elevate his game. And to go back to Flash 1, 2, 3 and the 2 issues of Justice League with the JSA, the Carmine Infantino art is so good in its storytelling way that must have helped Gardner Fox tell that story. Whereas the 2 issues of the Justice League, it's just so crammed because poor Mike Sekowsky had to draw all those characters. Then I'm sure it didn't help Gardner Fox tell that story in words as well as he might have done. So this is a whole other theme, really, for an essay. There are so many comics essays that can be done that were covered probably by Comics Journal over the years. But just how often is a writer's work elevated and his or her writing elevated by the standard of the artwork at hand. And just to make this point still further, so before we go on, so it's not just about the George Perez's and the John Byrnes, but about the good storytellers. So let's go to Don Heck.
Oh, yes.
Often maligned, but nobody does shifting camera angles almost as well as Don Heck. And when Don Heck actually has a good inker, it's good. And his work in the 50s was excellent, and the very early 60s. But then he got stuck with rush this, rush that, do this overnight, and here's your crappy inker. But Don Heck knows how to tell a story.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, Don Heck could help a writer elevate his game because, the story is well told visually. Whereas if it's not well told visually, then I think it's a bigger challenge. So some writers probably really appreciated working with Don Heck because, okay, it's laid out. Like Steve Englehart worked with him on Giant Size Avengers because whoever was assigned to do it couldn't do it in time. But it's clear there, a clear path for Steve Englehart to dialogue, caption, and so on. So I know you said you didn't really like the Carmine Infantino art. I like Carmine Infantino art so much so that 9 times out of 10 I read, oh my God, his art on Nova was so bad.
Right.
I'm thinking, no, his art on Nova actually got me to start reading it after I'd given up on it a long time before that because it was just so ho-hum.
Sure.
No, he's got very dynamic art when he cares to do it well. But this Carmine Infantino art on Flash wasn't flashy.
Yes.
But it was good storytelling.
I'll agree with that. And I'm glad you mentioned Don Heck because since I just read or skim read the entire Jerry Conway Justice League run, there was a couple issues that stood out, and they were drawn by Don Heck. I think it's one where they time travel to the Wild West, but it's like a different writer. It's so good, and it's all because of Don Heck. And I've always liked Don Heck, even like his mid '80s Wonder Woman run that he did right before George Perez rebooted. It's great. I love his art. But you're right. Obviously, he's better with a good inker. When he had in the Justice, or sorry, on the Avengers, was he inked by John Buscema? I don't remember.
You mean he did the early '60s, of course.
Yeah.
And again, to give credit where it's due, that he plotted those Avengers stories.
Okay.
As he said that was the most fun he ever had in his professional life was working with Stan Lee. But Stan Lee would just tell him, well, here's the beginning, here's the end, do what you like with the rest of it.
Right.
So he plotted, just as much because that's his story in between the very beginning and very end. So there's the early '60s. I'm trying to think. I think he had a range, maybe a range of inkers. Then he also did it again for a time. Early Steve Englehart.
Okay.
With Magneto and Brotherhood and
right.
This, but they usually gave him John Tartaglione, if I pronounced it correctly. Otherwise, John Tartaglione, who wasn't. Oh, Mike Esposito.
Sure, he's okay. Yeah.
They're kind of crude on him. But anyway, Don Heck drawing Avengers in the early '60s was good.
Yeah.
Because that's some of my earliest Avengers stuff. Was also as a weekly black and white reprint in Terrific, and so I remembered Don Heck's Avengers when I came back to comics much later on.
Right. So here's the thing: we are here to talk about basically Earth 2. Now, just to wrap up our discussion of Earth 2 and the multiverse, you had said that you're glad the DC did what they did with the Crisis, but
in the mid '80s, I was.
Sure, but now, in your opinion, do you kind of agree with what I said that DC's continuity would be better, more concise if they just had Earth 1, Earth 2?
Yeah, just leave it at that. Earth 1 and Earth 2. So now, isn't it funny? It's kind of funny because since the mid '80s, I've been one of the people like online saying, "Hey, good job, DC. So glad you did that." It made it a relief for me, readers like me, and about 8 out of 10 other people would say, "Oh, BS. We missed all the other Earths." And here I am right now, 2023, thinking, "No, DC, no, you had a good thing there. You separated the Golden Age from the Silver Age, Earth 1, Earth 2. Just that's magical. Every so often, your writers can take these characters off to Earth 2 and meet Earth 2 this character or that character.
Right.
So, but when you did Crisis, you blew it away. You lost that.
Yes. And you know what? I like Marv Wolfman, but I really blame him for, oh, I mean, even to be honest, this is a whole other discussion. I'm not a fan of Nightwing. I think Dick Grayson should have stayed
Oh,
as Robin.
yeah.
I don't like the idea of aging superheroes at all. And I think this is, in a way, I kind of blame the fact that, we talked earlier about how these comics were aimed more at kids. I think Marv Wolfman and his generation, they were the first people that grew up on comics and then became professionals, right? And so instead of having these professional science fiction ex-novelists like Gardner Fox and Otto Binder drawing these superheroes, or sorry, writing these superheroes for kids, you have people like Marv Wolfman, maybe Denny O'Neil, John Byrne, who grew up on these characters, and they're like, well, I'm a middle-aged man, so I want Spider-Man to be middle-aged and married and whatever. And with Robin, it's like, well, now Robin's got to grow up and become Nightwing. The problem is if you take that idea to its conclusion, you end up with senior citizens, and then they end up dying, which no fanboy will. Oh, well, that's ridiculous to age them that much. But to me, once you start aging, why stop? That's why I just think it's a better idea to keep the Legion of Superheroes as teenagers. Keep the X-Men as teenagers. Keep Robin as the kid sidekick. Just leave it at that. But the cool thing about Earth 2 is Earth 2, you can age them because they're already tied to World War II, right? So
Yes.
Superman always started in 1938. Wonder Woman always started in 1942. And you can, if you want to visit them when they're middle-aged, you visit them in the 80s. If you want to visit Earth 2 now, Superman's already dead. Maybe there's his son. I don't know. Batman died in the 70s. Maybe there's a new Batman, right? It's like you said, you can have the Justice League now, go visit them and have all kinds of wild stories and wild team-ups. Why not, right?
Yeah, the thing about aging, because we really enjoyed the Steve Ditko Spider-Man. But then he went from high school and then he went to college. I didn't mind that, really. I thought, oh, this is how college is in the US. You can just get up and walk out.
Sure,
Walk
sure,
out.
right.
I remember that scene and I was quite shocked by that. He just got up and walked out.
Yeah.
And but then he had to go and get married. And it's going too far. It really, and then we're talking about something from a long time ago, but it's going too far. He's an everyman who has to sew up his outfit, but then his girlfriends are supermodels, and he looks
Right.
like Elvis, and
Mm-hmm.
and he's getting married. I mean, no. So
Agreed.
I know what you mean about the aging, but there was a problem. Do you remember? You might not actually, because this was in the mid 70s. Mid 70s. Steve Englehart was still at Marvel, and he and others were complaining because Stan Lee had spoken about the illusion of change.
Sure.
And said that really they should change, but they shouldn't change because of all the marketing tie-ins.
Mm-hmm.
Kids' toys and this and that, so we can't have Spider-Man be something else. So the illusion of change. But some of the writers then, like you said, they'd grown up on comics. They'd grown up on comics where the characters didn't change, but they themselves as writers wanted characters to change and evolve. And like you said, you take it through to a logical conclusion, then where does that end? Ultimately, you're going to kill them off.
Right.
Because this is not Spider-Man, but he had to change. He had to go from high school to college. He had to go from college to being married. No, he didn't.
Right. Agreed. And what's funny is having Peter Parker in college is a good compromise because it ages him a little bit, but you can be in college forever. You can be a part-time student. You can keep coming back, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a good workaround. Keep him in college, but he can be any age. He can be 17. He can be whatever. You just don't mention it. You don't say how old he is, right? You just have him in college. But the other thing, the one more point I want to make, it's interesting about Chris Claremont because the fact that he stayed on X-Men for so long, 17 years, it's an interesting experiment because he got bored with doing the typical Professor X in the danger room, in the mansion, blah, blah, blah. And he got so bored of it that he put them in Australia, right? He got rid of Professor X, he got rid of Kitty, and he got rid of almost everything that made it successful, but it's because he was bored with it. And I'm sure, I mean, I do love Chris Claremont, but by the mid 80s, I think most people were, even though they were buying X-Men, they were bored of it. Like the whole Outback era, even though I have some fond memories of it, it's almost like you could see him just being, I'm bored of this whole premise. So I'm just going to have, like at one point, Cyclops was off with Madeline Pryor, almost like retired at age 21. I don't know. They have this boat together or a plane or whatever. And, then the X-Men are in the Outback, completely removed from the rest of the Marvel Universe. And there was some interesting ideas in there. But it's just interesting to see, once a writer writes characters that long, how it can be detrimental to the premise. And that's why I think when Jim Lee came on, he was like, well, this is not at all what I want to do. I want to do Magneto, and I want to do the Savage Land, and I want to do Professor X. And I think that's ultimately what led to, if you remember, Chris Claremont basically was like, okay, well, screw this. I think the book should be this way. And Jim Lee thought I should think the book should be this way. And the editor at the time, what was his name?
Bob Harras.
Yes, he sided with Jim Lee, and so that's why Chris Claremont left, right?
Because they were buddies. The editor always makes a big difference. I always thought Chris Claremont needed not just John Byrne, but Roger Stern. Stern, he was editing it, and Roger Stern and John Byrne were good pals. So they kept it on track. They kept Chris Claremont restrained. But Louise Simonson was in the Chris Claremont camp, not the John Byrne. She rolled her eyes about John Byrne. Literally, to me, rolled her eyes about. Oh yeah, at a convention, San Diego, I think. Yeah. And
you've got to tell me the story now. You got to tell me what was the context of the eye rolling.
She was talking to me and a couple of other people, and there were some other Marvel people around, and the name John Byrne came up, and she said, "Oh yeah, John Byrne." And she had this expression, and her eyes rolled around in her head. And no, she was in the Chris Claremont camp. I mean, John Byrne left when she was editor because, now they weren't paying that much attention to him. Whereas when Roger Stern was there, Roger Stern and John Byrne kept Chris Claremont in check. So now he wasn't kept in check. And so then you start getting all this other stuff that it would never have happened under John Byrne. The Dracula, this stupid point Dracula story. And
I agree with you there. That whole idea was idiotic, but yeah, I agree with you on that.
So writers, whoever they're paired with means so much. And I asked, Steve Englehart when he was here. By here I mean where I live, because he was my guest, for the local convention. So I spent a couple of days with him. And I kind of asked him, like, well, were you ever kind of like disappointed? You usually didn't get to work with like the top artists, well, rarely, And he's like, no, I just, whoever they assigned.
Right.
It's a little strange because, I mean, didn't people like Marv Wolfman like ask for George Perez, for example? Wouldn't people do that? I really want to work with this one or that one. But as far as he was concerned, it's just whoever they assigned.
Right.
And so I'm mentioning this because Steve Englehart was such a good writer. But what about the artists he worked with? Did they have much input? Was it all Steve Englehart and they just drew according to what he told them? I think so. I can't think of anybody. I'm going through my mind who really had input with Steve Englehart the way John Byrne did, because John Byrne was a co-plotter.
Sure.
Steve Englehart never had a co-plotter, but John Byrne did.
From the little I know of the Detective Comics run, I don't think he had much interaction with Marshall Rogers.
Yeah, none.
Right. In fact, the last few issues were drawn by Walt Simonson, weren't they?
No, the way it started off was he wrote these things well in advance.
Okay, right.
And first Walt Simonson was on it with Al Milgrom, but
Okay, I get it back.
whatever a particular approach they took, what Simonson just did, like bare layouts, and Al Milgrom was using a particular method of finishing, and it was just awful. I mean, I have
Right.
those issues, the Dr. Phosphorus ones, and then Julius Schwartz, thank goodness, assigned Marshall Rogers and Terry Austin because they had done a backup before
Sure.
Stephen Englehart arrived, and which the fans liked, and with good reason. And so Julius Schwartz assigned them. And then Steve Englehart found, to his great surprise, that it was a perfect match, perfect, because he wanted to bring back the early 1940s style with the thicker panels and the highlighted first letter in the captions and everything. So that was serendipitous, absolutely. But you would have thought, the way it turned out, Steve Englehart and Marshall Rogers must have sat down and gone over all this the way Don McGregor did with Billy Graham on the Black Panther.
Right.
But he had already gone to Europe. He was
going
on a sabbatical in Europe for a year or so, and then came back and discovered, wow, look how my stories were drawn. So some artists do have a great input, and I think that makes such a difference. Chris Claremont with Dave Cockrum was good, but Dave Cockrum had a lot of input.
Mm-hmm.
He created the Star Jammers, for example,
and
the new uniforms and new characters, and then Steve Englehart. So we're both losing our minds now. And Chris Claremont with John Byrne, great input. But then Dave Cockrum came back, but it was monthly. It was too much for him.
Right.
And then after that, which artist had such input again? And I know you like the Paul Smith run. I do too, but how much input did Paul Smith have, or did he just simply draw what Chris Claremont asked him to draw? This would be a good question to ask Chris Claremont, wouldn't it?
Actually, it would be a great question, but there's one answer I could give you, and that's because they plotted the story together in a car, I believe, in a traffic jam, and that was the Wolverine miniseries with Frank Miller.
Oh yes, that was right. But that's Frank Miller.
Sure. Yeah.
As much a writer as an artist.
100%. Yeah, 100%. But you're right. I don't imagine John Romita Jr. or Mark Silvestri had much influence on the plots. However, Jim Lee certainly did, because he changed the direction of the book, and eventually that's what led to Claremont quitting, right? So there you go, Jim Lee.
One last thing about X-Men, which is funny since this topic, the Flash, and the JLA and JSA. But some people criticize Grant Morrison's X-Men. That
my favorite
X-Men really brought me back to X-Men.
Me too.
Because he went to the spirit of X-Men. They're outsiders, they're misfits, they're distrusted. It's a little bit should be a little bit kind of creepy. That is X-Men, not conventional stuff. Giving Storm a mohawk is not X-Men.
I liked it, but
for me, that's just sensationalism.
Sure.
And Grant Morrison's like, no, what is the X-Men? I mean, giving Storm a mohawk doesn't make the X-Men on the edges, on the fringes of society.
Sure.
And that's why Grant Morrison did such a great job with Doom Patrol. He got straight to the heart of Doom Patrol. This is what Doom Patrol is. You're misfits, and you end up with facing the Brotherhood of Dada and stuff like that. So, what was my point? Was it about artists and input and this and that? The artists, they're so crucial in different ways.
Of course, and like you said though about Grant Morrison, is he's able to, I think, boil down the essence of any concept when he takes it on. Which that's a topic for another episode, because Grant Morrison is my favorite writer, so I could talk about him all day. But for now, we're gonna have to wrap up this episode. We had a very good discussion about this concept, but I think we both agree that the JSA JLA story was disappointing, doesn't quite hold up, but the concept itself is great.
Sure. Nice concept. Nice concept.
All right. So anyway,
execution almost impossible.
Yes, but we'd like to have you on again in the near future. So I'll definitely be in touch with some of the some upcoming episodes. I want to thank you again for joining me.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be in touch soon. So until the next time, see you later.